The stock market only has one side, not the bullish side or the bearish side, but the right side. Reminiscences of a Stock Operator by Edwin Lefevre, based on the life and voice of Jesse Livermore, is not merely a memoir of a speculator. It's a classic book where market fluctuations become the material for dissecting human psychology, fear, greed, patience, and even self-destruction, from the days the boy stood writing prices in a brokerage firm until he became Wall Street's notorious Boy Plunger. The story constantly reflects on one question: why do we always repeat our mistakes? And how can an individual learn from their own financial wounds? Let's begin summarizing this book. Part 1. I was not born with a silver spoon asterisk. Everything began with the cold numbers on the ticker tape. At just 14, I worked in a stock office, holding chalk to write down stock prices transmitted from the telegraph machine onto the large wall-mounted board. The job seemed monotonous, but to me, each number was like a piece of music. I learned to memorize them, connecting them into an orderly, hidden current. While others saw only meaningless symbols, I saw repeating patterns without anyone teaching me. I soon realized the market was not as chaotic as it appeared. Values had a rhythm. They rose and fell in patterns that a keen eye could discern. Whenever a stock moved within a certain range, I knew it would break out or fall eventually. This repetition wasn't an illusion. It became my initial belief that the market could be read, like an open book. After a few months, I had memorized every fluctuation. My excitement grew as I realized I could predict the next move of prices. At that time, I had no significant capital, but I longed to try my luck. So I stepped into a bucket shop, a place where small players like me could bet on stock movements without actual buying or selling. In the bucket shop, I placed my first trades with just a few pennies, but it was enough to make my heart pound. And surprisingly, my predictions, based on remembered patterns, yielded results. I won small, but it was an unforgettable feeling to see the numbers move in the direction I anticipated. I understood I had found my path. I repeated it again and again. Each winning trade further strengthened my conviction. I didn't know the concepts of luck or risk. I only believed I could read the market, and the marketat least in the bucket shop paid for that keenness. I went from one shop to another, using small profits to fuel growing ambitions. But success too early also brought an unexpected consequence. The bucket shop owners started to notice. They didn't like customers who always won. For them, a good customer was a loser. I was refused trades, eyed with suspicion. I understood that in this game, to survive, I had to learn to evade, change my name, move locations like a hunted wanderer. Still, I couldn't stop. The faint light from those early small victories became a fire that burned me every night as I lay down. I recalled the number sequences, telling myself I had found a secret that the whole street seemed to overlook. The ticker boy had transformed into someone eager to conquer, and from that moment, my life became inextricably linked to the market. A life that would take me to the highest peaks and deepest lows, but would never release me. After the bucket shops grew suspicious, I had to find every way to continue. I changed my name, borrowed friends' identities, moving from street to street. It was like a game of cat and mouse, and I was the tenacious mouse. Each time I won a few trades, I knew the shop owners started watching. They always found ways to delay, extend order entry times, or change rules to disadvantage me. But I was young then and trusted my instincts. My quickness in reading the ticker saved me from many traps. A quick glance was all I needed to predict patterns, and most of those predictions were correct. Once I walked into a new bucket shop, and within a few days, earned so much that the manager wouldn't let me play anymore. Gradually, I realized these places weren't the real market, they were just distorted copies. Every transaction was merely a recorded number, no actual stocks were bought or sold, and thus, it had limits. Shop owners never allowed customers to win indefinitely. When I won too much, they closed their doors to me. The Cosmopolitan incident came as a test. They set a trap in Suga stock. Rumors spread that the price would soar. But on the ticker, I saw the opposite, repetitive fluctuations signaling danger. I decided not to follow the crowd. A few days later, the rumors collapsed and those who participated lost everything. I stood safely outside and for the first time felt the value of not believing others' words. That Suga trap became a vital lesson. I understood that bucket shops could teach me how to read short-term signals, but they couldn't give me a comprehensive view of the market. I won on small fluctuations, but that was just the surface. The real market out there was larger, harsher, and couldn't be manipulated with just a few tricks. I continued my evasive game in St. Louis. I used a fake name to open an account in a bucket shop. It was smooth at first, but then I was discovered. The shop owner locked the account, keeping all my winnings. I reacted violently, but they just smirked. It was an unwritten rule: winners were not welcome. I realized I had reached the limits of this game. The feeling of being deprived choked me. But instead of retreating, I became even more determined to enter the real market. If bucket shops were just a small pond, the New York Stock Exchange was an ocean. I knew I'd face sharks, but I couldn't stay in this cramped pond forever. And so, with what little capital I had left, I decided to abandon the bucket shop and head for New York. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I was sure of one thing: the numbers had bound me. I couldn't turn back, I could only move forward. When I arrived in New York, I carried the belief that the skills I'd honed in the bucket shops would bring me success. I chose a reputable brokerage firm, opened an account, and immediately began trading. For the first time, I was touching the real market, no longer a simulated game. But after just a few days, that belief was crushed. The ticker in bucket shops ran fast, prices almost instantaneous. The ticker on the real exchange, however, was slower, sometimes delayed by several minutes. This delay rendered all my predictions meaningless. I was accustomed to reading instant rhythms. Now I only saw outdated information. The ticker became an echo of the past, and I was completely disoriented. I placed orders based on intuition but was constantly wrong. The real market didn't behave like the bucket shop. Here, there were too many variables: big players, capital flows, unexpected news. I was like someone lost, clinging to an old map in a brand new city. Money in my account evaporated quickly, coin by coin. Before long, I went bitterly bankrupt. That wasn't the last time I borrowed money to try and recover, but it only dragged me deeper. Each loss led to a spiral of self-doubt. I wondered if I truly understood the market or was just a lucky gambler in my previous wagers. With no way left in New York, I left for St. Louis. I sought out another bucket shop, hoping to recoup my capital. At first, things felt familiar again. I won a few trades, confident in my return. But then they quickly recognized me. I was refused, once again becoming unwelcome. I refused to give up. In Hoboken, I tried my luck again. I met H.S. Teller, a cunning character in the industry known for small-scale manipulations. He trapped me once, wiping out my meager capital. This time, I wouldn't surrender. I sought to turn the tables, pouring all my remaining sharpness into a retaliatory play. When Teller believed he had victory secured, I ambushed him with a surprise order. He was forced to pay in cash, and I left with a small sum, but accompanied by a feeling of triumph. Still, that victory was just a temporary splash of color on a bleak canvas. I understood I couldn't live off such petty revenges. The real market was too vast, and I was just a solitary individual. Bucket shops were merely playgrounds for short sprints, while New York was the true battlefield, demanding an entirely different approach. To survive, I had to learn to detach from small fluctuations. It was time to think about the big picture, about trends, instead of chasing every single tick. But to do that, I needed more than capital. I needed a new mindset. After the successful revenge in Hoboken, I walked out onto the street with more money in my pocket than when I went in. But the exhilaration quickly gave way to a sense of emptiness. I knew clearly that such tit-for-tat wins and losses could not be the foundation for building a career. Every game with someone like Teller was just a small play, yielding only a bit of money and momentary satisfaction. That was not the path to conquering the market. Sitting alone, I began to reflect on my days in the bucket shops. I won a lot, but it was all based on recognizing short-term fluctuations. The real market, I realized, operated on an entirely different rhythm. Those small ups and downs didn't determine who survived. They were merely ripples on the surface of a lake. True power lay in the great waves that swept everything along, and only those who knew how to follow them could survive. This truth momentarily crushed me, but it also opened up a new perspective. If I kept diving into every small fluctuation, I would forever be at a disadvantage in the New York game. But if I learned to recognize the main current, I could turn my fortune around. The problem was, I didn't have enough capital to follow the big swings. Each time I tried, my small sum was swallowed before the trend could fully reveal itself. I lived in that paradox, understanding what needed to be done but lacking the power to execute it. Like someone seeing an open door, but the distance was too far to reach. That torment haunted me daily. I continued to struggle among small brokerage offices, trying to hold on. But now I less believed in instant tricks. Instead, I observed, took notes, and tried to connect price movements with the overall context. I began to pay attention to broader factors: capital flows, political news, industry crises. The market was not a dice game but the result of fundamental conditions. During that time, I also had to face another enemy: myself. The instinct to act constantly urged me to place orders, but I forced myself to restrain, to learn how to stand aside. Every day, watching the ticker run, my heart burned. But I knew if I kept chasing, I would repeat the old cycle: win a few small games, then lose everything in one go. I sat in cafes, listening to brokers argue. They talked about specific stocks, who held them, who sold them, and the schemes being cooked up. I suddenly realized those stories helped me nothing. I couldn't rely on rumors or advice. To survive, I had to learn to listen to the market itself, not the chatter on the street. The market was the only teacher; all other voices were just noise. From my experiences in Hoboken, I understood that I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer the bucket shop boy who only clung to short-term rhythms. I began to think like a holistic observer. Though not yet strong enough to act fully, perhaps I was just a speck of dust in a giant machine. But if that speck of dust knew to move with the current, it wouldn't be crushed. After months of struggle, I gradually saw a simple but brutal truth: there is no bull side, no bear side, only the right side. The market doesn't care about anyone's hopes or beliefs. It moves according to its own power. And either you go with it or you get crushed. I believed I could choose a side. Sometimes I eagerly bought in because I felt the market had to rise. Other times, I had a prejudice against a stock and aggressively shorted it, believing the price was certain to fall. But every time the market taught me a lesson. It didn't bother to confirm what I thought. If I was wrong, it simply continued in the opposite direction, draining my account. That's when I ingrained the principle: never argue with the ticker. The tape doesn't lie. It only reflects reality. Getting angry at the market because it goes against expectations is like getting angry at your lungs for having pneumonia. The market doesn't listen to please, nor does it care about our internal logic. It simply exists and operates by its own rules. I also witnessed countless people lose money by listening to tips. Some were whispered by friends that a certain stock was about to rise, so they poured all their money in. When the price fell freely, they wondered why. Others listened to brokers whisper about inside information, only to find out it was just fragmented information distorted by the market. Others' advice is often a sweet trap. I don't deny it. Sometimes tips can be right, but that's just by chance. Relying on tips to trade is like walking on cracked ice. Sooner or later, you'll fall through. Only by observing for yourself and believing what you see can you survive. I remember one time I bought a stock solely because a friend insisted it would rise. For the first few days, just as he said, the price ticked up and I was ecstatic, thinking I would win big this time. But then, from nowhere, the price began to fall. I stubbornly held on, hoping it would recover instead of cutting my losses. I watched my account evaporate day by day. Eventually, I had to sell at a devastating loss. The pain wasn't just the money lost, but the knowledge that I had betrayed my principles. I had traded not based on my own convictions, but on someone else's words. From then on, I learned to detach myself from the crowd. The market is full of people who believe they are right because they hold stocks. But I was different. I had to be right before buying, not after. If the market told me I was wrong, I would accept it immediately, no arguments. This principle sounds obvious, but living by it requires great discipline. Because human nature always wants to hold on to beliefs, always hopes that tomorrow the price will reverse. But hope doesn't pay margin calls, nor does it save an account. Only the truth from the tape decides. Be on the market side, not on the side of emotion. I once thought that if I was quick enough, I could take a sum from the market every day like a regular job. But the market isn't a place for steady salaries. It wasn't created to satisfy my daily needs. Every time I tried to force it, the outcome was the same: a cycle of winning, then losing, getting rich in a flash, then going broke just as quickly. The first time I lost everything, I blamed the ticker's delay. The second time, I blamed myself for being too overconfident. The third time, I attributed it to bad luck, but by the fourth and fifth times, I had no excuses left. Clearly, my biggest enemy wasn't the market, but myself. The addiction to action, that was the illness that cost me. I couldn't stand the feeling of being on the sidelines, not trading. Every time I saw the ticker jump, I felt compelled to jump in, like a gambler with shaky hands seeing the table. There were times I won continuously. The euphoria made me believe I had grasped the secret, but just one reversal and everything disappeared. The market seemed to deliberately teach me short-term victories weren't enough to save me. Just one mistake was enough to wipe out an entire string of successes. I began to realize that to succeed, I needed to learn patience. The market doesn't offer opportunities every day. True opportunities are rare, and when they appear, one must have enough capital and discipline to seize them. If I kept rushing into every small fluctuation, I was just bleeding myself to death. I remember days when I deliberately forced myself not to trade. I sat watching the ticker run, listening to people discuss, but placed no orders. Initially, the torment was agonizing. I felt I was missing out, afraid prices would run away while I stood on the sidelines. But after a while, I learned to restrain myself. And at that very moment, I realized the truth. The market never runs out of opportunities. There's always another day, another wave. If you miss today, there's still tomorrow. People often say time is money, but for me, time is more than that. Time is the only tool I have to escape impatience and learn to wait. No one loses money by staying out, but thousands go bankrupt because they can't control the urge to always be involved. The market doesn't care about impatience. It operates at its own pace, regardless of the observer's haste. And if I wanted to survive, I had to learn to synchronize with that rhythm instead of fighting it. Still, I don't deny that the addiction to action never completely left me. It lingered, lurking, waiting for me to drop my guard to pull me back into the old spiral. I understood that discipline isn't something achieved once and for all. It's a daily battle, a struggle between reason and instinct. And from these failures, I learned another lesson. Silence also has value in the market. Sometimes, doing nothing is the wisest action. After many failures and missteps, I entered a new phase in Saratoga. The summer of 1906, I had an experience that changed my entire speculative life. The event revolved around Union Pacific, a stock that was then in the spotlight. Previously, I was always captivated by short-term fluctuations, hunting for a few points of profit in every small movement. But Union Pacific taught me something different. I began to realize that small fluctuations were nothing compared to the power of a major wave. As that stock shifted, I clearly saw the current was no longer the game of a few manipulators, but the result of fundamental conditions driving the entire market. I bought in not because I believed anyone's words, but because the ticker itself pointed to the trend. And this time, I didn't exit early as was my old habit. I let the position run. I let the market do its work. The longer I held, the more I saw the power of the big swing. Every day, profits grew larger, and I understood that this was the real way to make money. The Saratoga experience opened my eyes. I saw that all my previous efforts chasing every oscillation were just child's play. Quick wins weren't enough to build a career. Big money lay in big movements, and to capitalize on them, I needed something I once lacked: patience. I also realized that once the market was in a trend, no one could stop it, not the pools, not the cunning brokers, not even the magnates had enough power to turn it. The market operated by its internal momentum, and my job wasn't to resist it, but to go with it. With Union Pacific, I changed my perspective. I no longer focused solely on analyzing individual stocks. I began to observe the big picture. When an entire list of stocks moved in one direction, that's when real opportunities emerged. I understood that by simply following the main current, I could earn more than with any trick before. From a quotation boy, from a wanderer in bucket shops, from bitter bankruptcies, I stepped into a different role. I no longer saw myself as a victim of small fluctuations. I saw myself as a companion to major trends. Let the market lead. Be patient and go with the big swing. That was the lesson that a string of failures had finally paid for. And I knew that from now on, the path ahead would be different. I was no longer just a boy playing a betting game. I had become a true speculator, with a mature mindset, ready for the tougher battles that lay ahead. Part 2. I felt a quiet but certain shift in my mind. The The sweat-soaked and bitter lessons from before began to coalesce into a clear principle: go with the market trend. I had once thought the secret lay in detecting small fluctuations, picking up a few points of profit at a time. But Union Pacific taught me that approach only led to exhaustion. I began to pay attention to the big swing instead of jumping in and out for a few points. I held onto positions, letting them run with the major current. The initial feeling was uncomfortable. I was used to closing quickly, pocketing the money. Now, letting the market do its part was like sitting on a hot seat, not knowing when the floor would collapse. But I knew if I wasn't patient, I would never achieve worthwhile profits. From then on, I also began to learn how to position myself in the main current of the market. Instead of clinging to individual stocks, when the market rises, it's best to buy and let the trend lift you. When the market falls, the only way is to short and go with it. It sounds obvious, but to live by this principle requires a whole process of honing one's instincts. Human instinct always wants to resist, always believes that tomorrow prices will reverse. But I learned to believe what the ticker said, not what I hoped for. I remember once, during a strong bull market, I bought in quite early. When the price ticked up a few points, my instinct told me to take profits, but I held back. I thought, if I'm right about the trend, why rush to withdraw? I maintained the position. And sure enough, a few weeks later, the profit was many times the amount I had initially wanted to close out. That patience yielded more than all my previous tricks. I also began to observe those around me. Most were impatient. They treated the market like a quick ATM. Some just wanted a few $100s to buy a jacket or a luxury item. But the market isn't a cash cow. It never rewards short-term schemes. I saw them repeating my own past mistakes, trying to milk every small fluctuation, and then leaving the exchange empty-handed. I gradually realized that the market operates like a great river. If you jump in to scoop a few drops, you'll only get your hands wet and tired. But if you learn to drift with the main current, the whole river will carry you far. And the prerequisite for that is patience, the ability to endure temporary fluctuations to await the revelation of large profits. This principle became the foundation for all my subsequent decisions. It didn't immediately make me successful in every trade, but it fundamentally changed how I viewed the market. I stopped seeing every small fluctuation as an opportunity and began to search for decisive movements. And once I found them, I poured my efforts into them instead of scattering myself across countless small games. This wasn't simple. I still had moments of weakness, still craved action. But the difference was that I knew where I was going. I was no longer lost in the maze of short-term fluctuations. I had seen the way out, and it lay in patiently following the trend. As I began to practice my new principle, Wall Street presented me with another challenging environment: price manipulation by pools. In those days, a pool was a group of big players who banded together to push prices up or down, creating illusions for the public. They controlled news, spread rumors, and created smokescreens, all to serve a single goal: to sell their stocks to others at a higher price. I soon recognized their power. Once a pool got together, the stock would dance to a prearranged script. Outsiders who didn't understand the game were often swept in and became victims. I witnessed many people being drawn in, thinking they'd found an opportunity, only to be mercilessly drowned. I was caught up a few times myself. I vividly remember one instance. A group spread rumors that a railway company was about to announce huge profits. The stock price soared, and the public rushed to buy. I had considered participating, but the ticker showed me unusual signs. The buying and selling volume didn't match the spreading story. I held back. Just a few weeks later, the price crashed, the public lost everything, while the pool had secretly unloaded their shares beforehand. From these experiences, I understood that the power of pools could not be underestimated. They had money, news, and the ability to influence the crowd. But I also realized something more important. Even pools couldn't go against the general market trend. If the market was in a bull market, efforts to depress prices were only temporary. If the market fell into a bear market, no group was strong enough to keep stocks high forever. Therefore, I learned to observe pools differently. I no longer thought about resisting or following them, but rather placed them within the overall picture. Pools could push prices in the short term, but the long-term trend still determined the outcome. If I knew how to combine both observing the pool's game while simultaneously moving with the main trend, I could both avoid traps and seize opportunities. From this, I also formed the habit of not allowing myself to become someone else's tool. The market is full of psychological traps. Pools don't need to win every battle. They just need the majority to lose. And if I wasn't vigilant enough, I would also be one of them. I recall another time, a pool group enticed me to join, sweetly inviting me, saying it was an unmissable opportunity. But I refused. I knew that if I entered, I would just be a latecomer, buying in as they prepared to sell out. Refusing a false opportunity is much harder than jumping in, but that's what kept me safe in those days. I understood that the market wasn't just a battle between me and the ticker, but also a war against all sorts of other players, rumors, and even crowd psychology. But the principle was firm in my mind. Let the major trend decide. Don't be led by someone else's script. The year 1907 was a turning point, not just for Wall Street, but for my own life. Months beforehand, I had seen unusual signals: tightening credit, banks frantically calling for capital, while the stock market climbed as if unstoppable. I had been through many ups and downs, and I knew that when everything seemed too favorable, that's often when danger lurked. I watched the ticker daily. Beneath the seemingly strong numbers, I detected a weakness. Trading volume was no longer exploding as before, and rallies were no longer decisive. The crowd still believed the market would rise indefinitely, but I saw something else: storm warnings. Then news spread about instability in the banking system. Stocks began to wobble. I knew my moment had arrived. I decided to short sell on an unprecedented scale, not a few hundred or a few thousand shares, but orders large enough to stake my entire career. When the ticker printed scorching red lines, I didn't tremble. I had waited for this moment too long. The crisis erupted exactly as I predicted. Stocks collapsed day by day, hour by hour. The crowd frantically sold off. Cries of despair echoed through brokerage offices, while I, with every hour watching the ticker, saw my account swell. Each market drop was a step pushing me higher. In the end, I made millions of dollars in a few weeks. From a wanderer in bucket shops from a once expelled Boy Plunger, I suddenly became a giant of Wall Street. My name resonated everywhere. The press called me a short-selling genius, the one who foresaw the crisis while the entire crowd was still intoxicated. I remember that feeling very clearly, not just the joy of victory, but a confirmation of the principles I had learned. Going with the major trend, trusting the ticker, patiently waiting for the big swing, had finally proven its worth. These were no longer petty profits from a bucket shop. This was a triumph on a real battlefield with real money and under the gaze of all Wall Street. Of course, with the glory came loneliness. People admired me but also resented me. Some whispered I was just lucky. Others threatened to teach me a lesson, but all those words couldn't deny the truth. I had won, and not by luck, but by what the ticker had whispered to me for months. The 1907 crisis became a milestone. It transformed me from someone seeking a foothold into an icon, but at the same time, it sowed in me a dangerous illusion that I could read every breath of the market, that from now on I possessed a special power. That belief would later lead me into new mistakes, but at that moment, I wasn't thinking far ahead. I only knew one thing. After countless bankruptcies and hardships, I had finally established my name. From Saratoga to the 1907 crisis, I had come full circle, and now I stood at a peak I once only dared to dream of. After the 1907 crisis, I sat at the peak with unprecedented wealth. My earnings drew the attention of the entire street. I could have rested, even retired for a while, but my nature wouldn't allow it. I wanted to test myself in new horizons, and so I turned to the commodities market. The exchanges in Chicago became my destination. There, people traded cotton, wheat, corn essentials for the entire economy. I told myself that if I could read stocks, commodities wouldn't be much different. It was all just supply and demand, right? But I quickly realized the difference. Stocks were often influenced by public psychology, while commodities had another variable: seasons and nature. A rain shower or a drought could change the entire picture, and these factors didn't follow any logic that the ticker could promptly reflect. I started with cotton. Initially, everything seemed favorable. I studied the data, saw tight supply and strong demand, and bet on an upward trend. The price did rise, and I made my first profits. The feeling of victory made me think I had conquered a new field, but then reality slapped me in the face. Commodities were not stocks. Prices could reverse suddenly due to an unforeseen factor: a crop report, a minor change in transportation, or even just a weather rumor. What I thought were sure signals suddenly vanished. I tried to maneuver, but the deeper I went, the more I found myself trapped in a situation I couldn't control. With wheat and corn, the situation was no better. I shorted them, believing supply was abundant. But suddenly, a large group in Chicago lets call its leader Stratton decided to corner the market. Prices were pushed up regardless of reality, and I was stuck in a losing position. I used to hope the weather would change, roads would freeze so farmers could bring grain to market. But nature didn't cooperate. I was helplessly stuck, watching prices move against me. Unlike stocks, where I could trust the ticker to read crowd psychology, commodities left me blind. I couldn't argue with rain or snow, nor could I negotiate with someone who cornered the entire corn market. My tools suddenly became useless. The more I traded, the more I realized I was stepping into an unfamiliar game. On Wall Street, I knew who the opponents were, the pools, the public's rules. But in Chicago, the enemies were much more invisible: weather, harvests, and the insatiable greed of a few giants. I started losing money not because of a lack of skill, but because I carried excessive confidence from stocks into a different field. I thought I was invincible, but the commodities market proved otherwise. While struggling with grains, I also fell into a cotton venture that, even now, I recall with shame. The story began very mundanely. I wanted to buy a luxurious fur coat, a gift for myself after years of stress. But instead of using the money I already had, I thought the way many on Wall Street once did: let the market pay for this gift. I entered the cotton market with that mindset. I didn't look at overall supply and demand, nor did I analyze deeply. I just wanted to quickly earn a few $1,000s to pay for the coat. At that very moment, I was no longer a speculator, but merely a gambler. I hoped instead of asterisk knowing asterisk. Initially, the price moved in the right direction, and I saw myself nearing my goal. But then, just a small correction was enough to wipe out my profits. I didn't stop. I tried to recover, thinking the market owed me that money. But the market owes no one anything. It continued to move against me, and before long, I lost everything, not just the profits, but also the meager capital left from previous trades. Sitting, watching my account balance drop to zero, I felt humiliated. A Wall Street genius who had just successfully shorted during a crisis, now brought down by a fur coat. I called that the peak of foolishness in my career, because there's nothing more absurd than forcing the market to act as a gift-giving fairy. I realized that when you enter a trade with the purpose of paying for an item, a short-term need, it's no longer speculation, it's just gambling in disguise. Instead of analyzing conditions, all I could do was hope. And hoping is a sure path to destruction. In fact, Wall Street was full of people like me at that time. Some wanted to make money to buy a car, others wanted the market to pay for their yacht or new apartment. They placed orders with the excuse that they just needed a few points of profit, but the market didn't care. It never behaved like a benevolent fairy, and the results were often the same: they lost more than they hoped to gain. After that incident, I realized that the market is never a means to satisfy instant desires. It's not a place to ask for gifts, but a fierce battlefield. Only when I entered with a cool head, with patience and discipline, would I have a chance to survive. If I carried personal desires, I would fall back into the mire, like with this cotton debacle. That failure didn't just cost me money, it severely damaged my self-confidence. From the brilliant peak of 1907, I plunged straight to rock bottom, annihilating the reputation I had just built. But pain also brought truth. I saw my true face when I let emotions overpower reason, and that truth was not easy to swallow. After the cotton debacle, I should have stopped. But like everyone who has tasted a big victory, I was compelled to return. I told myself that just one successful trade would get everything back. That very thought pushed me into the most dangerous spiral: trading on debt. I borrowed from brokers and even from other offices that allowed me to trade without full margin. At first, they believed in my name, a man who had made millions during the 1907 crisis. But that belief quickly eroded as I continuously lost. I kept piling new hopes onto old debts with each new trade. There were days I sat before the ticker, my heart filled with greed. I saw a small opportunity and thought if I went in big, I could recoup everything in a single day. But immediately after, I was choked by fear when the price moved against me. I didn't dare to cut losses, hoping it would turn around. And that very hope was the fatal blow. The market didn't reverse because I prayed. It continued in the opposite direction until everything in my hands vanished. Greed, fear, hope. 3 enemies that every speculator carries within them. They are not far away, they sit right in our heads, whispering in our ears every time we place an order. I thought I had overcome them, but the truth was I had only masked them under short-term victories. When failure struck, they surged back stronger than ever. Debts grew larger and larger. I owed not only brokers but also borrowed from friends, from anyone who still believed I could recover. I remember sleepless nights, tossing and turning with the haunting debt figures in my head. I imagined each loss as a stone tied to my leg, pulling me gradually to the bottom. I still tried to trade, but without the confidence of a speculator. Instead, I acted like a desperate man, gambling on luck, and the market, which has no mercy, crushed me. I realized that when you trade with borrowed money, you chain yourself. You cannot be patient because with every passing minute, interest and pressure weigh heavily. You are forced to make a profit immediately, and that very haste is a death sentence. I had turned myself into easy prey for the market, with no choices left. From that abyss, I understood one thing: debt and speculation never go hand in hand. To survive, one must trade with their own capital and a cool head. If greed, fear, and hope lead the way, the outcome can only be destruction. After continuous collapses, I thought I would never recover. But at that very moment, I was forced to do something I had never truly done before: sit still and observe. With no capital left, no ability to make big trades, I had only one tool: my eyes. I watched the market operate from a distance. Instead of focusing on individual stocks, I began to concentrate on the big picture. I paid attention to how entire industry groups moved together, to the overall rhythm of the market as it entered an uptrend or downtrend. Gradually, I realized that the public often made the same mistake. They stayed too long in the initial bull market. In a rising market, everyone makes money. They believe it's due to their talent, not the trend. They become overly confident, holding onto stocks even when it's time to retreat, and when the trend reverses, that blind faith becomes shackles. I saw countless people go from huge profits to losing everything, simply because they refused to accept that the market had changed its face. I also saw the role of rumors and news from the press, brokers, and magnates. Each side had its own agenda. They said what benefited their positions, not objective truth. The public, wanting to hear, wanting someone to show them the way, believed them, bought, held, and then fell into traps. That observation made me realize that to survive, I couldn't be part of the crowd. I had to stand outside, calmly watching the masses rush in and flee, while I chose my timing according to the ticker's rhythm. The market never lies, only people deceive themselves. During that time, I learned not only how to read the market but also how to read myself. I clearly saw that every time I failed, it was because I fell into the same traps as the public: baseless hope, believing rumors, or being too greedy to retreat at the right time. If I wanted to go further, I had to train myself to escape these psychological traps. I began to return to the market little by little, without haste, without seeking quick recovery. I chose the clearest opportunities, followed major trends, and cut losses immediately when wrong. I no longer dared to view the market as a magical wallet that can dispense gifts. I saw it as a colossal machine, and my job was simply to find a way to integrate myself into that machine, not to resist it. It clearly showed the opposition between talent and weakness. I had the ability to read the market, but I also carried within me invisible enemies: greed, fear, hope. These very things pulled me from the peak of 1907 into the abyss of debt. But at the same time, that fall forged in me new eyes that saw the overall picture. Instead of being preoccupied with every small fluctuation, I ended this phase not in glory, but in calmness. I knew greater challenges lay ahead, but I also knew I had gained a valuable weapon: the ability to observe the whole picture and not get lost in the crowd. Part 3. They called me Black Cat. They called me Black Cat. It wasn't a name I chose, but one given to me by friends in the industry. After they witnessed several times that I appeared precisely at the moment stock prices violently reversed direction, they believed it was an omen, that whenever I was present, the market would turn. I didn't care much, but I knew the truth wasn't in superstition. Many asked, "On what basis do you suddenly buy or sell when nothing is clear?" They called it a hunch or intuition. But for me, hunches didn't exist in a mystical sense. What I had was ticker sense. a special kind of perception developed after years of sitting and watching the tape, letting every fluctuation gradually sink into my mind. It was like an experienced musician hearing a false note while an outsider wouldn't notice a thing. I remember most distinctly one time in Washington. That day, I was sitting in a meeting room with some friends, discussing tax matters. Everything was normal, there was no shocking news. But in my head, a bell rang, not a voice, not a prophecy, but the summation of a series of signals that had quietly accumulated over many days. Price rhythm, volume, the market's hesitation in each rally. All converged into a single urge: sell immediately. I stood up, apologized for having to leave the meeting, and immediately called my office. I ordered the sale of all my positions. A few hours later, the market crashed freely. Those who remained in Washington that day were stunned. They told me I had strange intuition, that I saw the future. I merely smiled, because I knew it wasn't vague intuition but the result of years of reading the ticker, allowing the smallest details to tap rhythmically into my subconscious. What others called luck, for me was an accumulation of warnings from tiny fluctuations. When isolated, they were meaningless, but when put together, they formed a predictive symphony. I didn't need high-flown theories or anyone's advice. The tape said enough. I just had to listen to it with complete concentration and vital experience. I never claimed to have a sixth sense. I only had memories of tens of thousands of price jumps, hundreds of reversals, all accumulated in my head. To the extent that when I saw a trembling number on the board, I knew what lay behind it. That knowledge wasn't conscious thought but a reflex, like a hunter hearing rustling leaves and knowing an animal is approaching. Therefore, I didn't believe in hunches, I believed in ticker sense. It wasn't magic but the product of sweat, failure, and patience. It didn't come in a day, but was etched into my mind through every loss of money, every time standing on the sidelines watching the market knock down the entire crowd. And from that Washington incident, I became even more certain. Success in speculation doesn't come from whispered secrets or ghostly murmurs. It comes from letting the ticker speak to you and having the courage to act immediately when everyone else is still confused about what's happening. From years of observation, I arrived at a concept I would later repeatedly emphasize. Stock prices usually follow the path of least resistance. It's like water flowing towards the side with the fewest submerged rocks. Many people try to draw charts, build complex theories. But for me, the answer was simpler. Find the direction in which the price can move most easily, and that will be the real path. In one cotton trade, I clearly saw this. Initially, all signs indicated the price was going up. I entered a position in that direction. But then I noticed weak rallies, a hesitation in each upward step, a sign the market was losing momentum. I immediately reversed, positioned myself on the opposite side, and right after, the price dropped like a stone. If I had clung to my initial belief, I would have lost everything. But by seeing that the path of least resistance had shifted, I escaped. This principle sounds simple, but it demands one condition. You must be ready to abandon your own viewpoint as soon as the ticker shows a different direction. That means putting aside ego, not clinging to the past. The market doesn't owe me an apology, and I have no privilege to make it follow my will. It only follows the path of least resistance, regardless of what I think. I also remember the tropical trading incident, a small but dramatic stock. This was a highly speculative stock where experienced players orchestrated a textbook short squeeze. First, they created the impression that prices would fall, luring short sellers to jump in. Then, once the short positions piled up, they unexpectedly bought en masse, pushing prices skyward. The short sellers were forced to buy back in a panic, further fueling the violent price increase. I followed this case not just as a participant, but as a researcher. I clearly saw how greed and fear were exploited. Greed made people short too much, believing prices would continue to fall, then fear made them buy back frantically, creating the surge. It was a vivid proof of my observation. History repeats itself because human nature never changes. The short squeeze at tropical trading was neither the first nor the last. It was just a variation of hundreds of other games I had seen. But the mechanism was the same, exploiting psychology, the crowd's repetitive habits. From the outside, people thought it was a sophisticated scheme. But in reality, everything revolved around a few primitive instincts, desire and fear. When I realized this, I trusted repetition even more. I didn't need to predict a new pattern. I just needed to wait for human nature to reveal its old patterns, and the market would repeat the old game. That's why I say the ticker is a mirror reflecting the crowd's instincts. Reading it isn't to find miracles, but to see old scenarios play out yet again. It was thanks to this belief in repetition that I maintained my calm when facing the market, instead of panicking at unexpected fluctuations. I viewed it as a copy of a play that had already been staged, and if I remembered the script correctly, I could predict the next act. In 1915, when the stock exchange reopened after being closed due to the war, a new wave swept into Wall Street. This time, it wasn't the familiar railway or industrial stocks, but a group the press called war brides, companies believed to benefit directly from the Allied powers' enormous demands. I still remember the atmosphere then. Everywhere, people talked about orders for weapons, clothing, and food for the European battlefields. The public believed that any company involved in producing guns, ammunition, or even just textiles would become a goldmine. People bought anything that was hyped, as long as it had the war label. The ticker printed insane numbers, prices rose day by day, hour by hour. Crowds jostled in brokerage offices, shouting orders. Many stocks that no one cared about a year earlier suddenly became the center of attention, pulled up to many times their real value. I observed all this with caution. I knew that this craze wasn't about business fundamentals, but about psychology. Collective greed had turned the market into a casino. The public believed they just needed to buy to win, that the war would last forever, and profits would flow endlessly. I participated, but I didn't rush in like the crowd. I chose clear moments, went with the trend, and profits came easily. But that very ease made me wary. I had been through enough cycles to know that when money comes too easily, it's a dangerous sign. And sure enough, before long, the euphoria began to fade. The war continued, but the market couldn't sustain its frantic pace forever. The public started to realize that many of the lauded companies lacked the real capacity to fulfill contracts. Stock prices stagnated, then gradually slid. Those who entered latest bore the heaviest consequences. They bought at the peak for fear of missing out, and when prices fell, they clung on, hoping for a recovery tomorrow. But the public's large profits largely existed only on paper. When it was time to withdraw money, they discovered they had nothing left. The war brides craze left a profound lesson. The market can explode due to an external event, but that explosion doesn't last indefinitely. It thrives on crowd psychology, and when that psychology shifts, everything vanishes. The market merely used the war as an excuse to repeat its age-old play, collective greed leading to collapse. I stood on the sidelines, watching the bewildered faces in the brokerage office. Some who had once boasted of colossal profits were now silent. Others who had called me Black Cat now sought my advice, but I had nothing to say beyond one truth. The market doesn't change, only the context changes, and people still repeat the same old mistakes, whether in peace or in war. During the war years, my broker friend, Jim Barnes, approached me with an offer difficult to refuse. He held a massive block of consolidated copper stock, hundreds of thousands of shares, and the banks backing him were starting to worry about distributing them to the market. Barnes knew only I, accustomed to big campaigns, had the skill to handle this situation. I never accepted a deal just because of a promise. First, I had to investigate the ownership structure. I traced every source and discovered a group, let's call them the Back and Gordon syndicate, held over 200,000 shares. That meant if I recklessly tried to pump the price up, that entire volume could flood the market at any moment, crushing all my efforts. I went to meet them. I stated plainly, if they wanted me to work the market, they had to halt their selling, giving me space to design a shrewd distribution campaign. They stared at me, weighed it, and finally agreed. They understood that a sell-off would only depress prices faster, whereas if I set the rhythm, they could exit in an orderly fashion. After securing that assurance, I began my plan. I never considered pushing the price sky high and then selling everything at the peak. That approach was too dangerous and naive. Instead, I chose to sell gradually on the way up. To do that, I had to create demand. And the most familiar way to create demand on Wall Street was through a wave of tips. Deliberate rumors began to leak. Consolidated Copper was preparing new contracts. The board had expansion plans. Some even said several large banks were about to get involved. I didn't need to spread news directly. Just a few vague signals and the crowd would inflate them themselves. The press added fuel to the fire, brokers whispered to clients, and soon the public rushed to buy as if it were the only opportunity left. The ticker reflected exactly what I expected. The price began to tick up. Trading volume was heavy. Barnes and I gradually distributed the enormous volume we held, a little each day, blended into the public's order flow. The job wasn't easy because I had to maintain a rhythm so no one realized shares were being offloaded. But thanks to experience, I knew how to conceal myself within the chaotic wave of buying and selling. The public thought they were participating in a new craze. In reality, they were shouldering the bank's burden. That's the essence of working the market, not pumping prices sky high, but shrewd distribution, making buyers unaware that they are taking shares from the biggest holders. With each step up in price, I shed a portion of the burden, and the more people bought in, the easier my campaign became. No one wants to believe they are just the final link in the distribution chain. But the truth is always harsh. When too many tips flood the street, that's when the smart money has already begun selling out. The consolidated copper campaign lasted for weeks. Each day, I carefully distributed a portion of the volume, not too little to arouse suspicion, nor too much to cause the price to collapse. The ticker printed numbers that made the market appear healthy. But I knew the truth. It was just the art of shrewd distribution. I didn't need to push the price to the heavens. What I did was to let the public believe this stock was on its way up, and I sold right on that upward path. The difference between me and the reckless ones was this: I didn't dream of selling everything at the very peak. I sold while there was still enough demand to absorb. By the time the price reached a level where the market no longer wanted to push it higher, most of the volume was already in the public's hands. The banks breathed a sigh of relief. They had exited an enormous block that, without a plan, could have buried them all. As for me, I left that venture with the satisfaction of having perfectly played my role as the conductor in a silent transfer process. Also, during that time, I had an experience that deeply etched itself into my memory. One day, I visited my usual tailor to try on a suit. The young seamstress, as she sewed and chatted, unexpectedly mentioned that her family had just bought consolidated copper stock. Surprised, I asked her why. She replied, "Because everyone says Mr. Livermore is going to push it up." I was stunned. That tailor knew nothing about the ticker, nothing about pools, yet her family had poured their money into a stock just because they heard a tip and that tip carried my name, even though I had never breathed a word to anyone. Rumors spread like wildfire, blowing into the most ordinary homes, sweeping away the meager savings of working people. When I walked out of that tailor shop that day, I told myself once again, that's why I never give tips. Tips don't help anyone except the person spreading them to serve their own position. The public always believes a tip is a secret opportunity, but in truth, it's just bait. And the victims are often people like the tailor's family people who cannot afford a mistake. If there's one thing I learned from the copper deal, it's that the public never gets the fat part. They enter when everything has been arranged, when demand is inflated by tips, when insiders are preparing to withdraw, and when the truth is revealed, they are the ones left holding piles of worthless paper. I can share general views about the market, but I never tell anyone to buy or sell a specific stock. Because once I do that, whether accidentally or intentionally, I would turn them into tools in my own game. And I don't want to carry that burden on Wall Street. Every time the market crashes, people often have a familiar explanation, blaming the short sellers. They call it a bear raid, an attack aimed at lowering stock prices by selling en masse. The public likes this explanation because it's simple, easy to understand, and gives them a concrete enemy to curse. But the truth, as I witnessed it, was entirely different. I have been through many price collapses, and I assert that the worst drops do not come from short sellers, but from insiders distributing their own holdings. When prices have been pushed too high, when the public eagerly buys at any cost, that's when the biggest holders quietly unload. And once they decide to sell, no power can stop prices from falling. Take the example of New York and Hartford Railroad. At one point, this stock reached $255, the peak of public confidence. But then, when the largest holders began selling, the price fell uncontrollably, down to $12. The public called it a bear raid. But I ask, could any short-selling group push a giant company from $255 down to $12 if not for the insiders themselves offloading shares? Or the international nickel case, it was similar. The press loudly reported a short-selling conspiracy, and as usual, my name was dragged into it. Jesse Livermore behind the bear raid. It sounded plausible. The public needed someone to vent their anger on. But the truth was, international nickel had been pumped up by rumors, by deliberate tips. And when it reached maturity, the insiders sold out. I was just a convenient scapegoat. The public always makes the same mistake. They stay too long in a bull market. When the market rises, they make a little profit, then greedily hold on for more, believing tomorrow will be even higher. They ignore warning signs, from weakening volume to stagnating prices. They hold until the market no longer supports them, and when the fall begins, they are swept into a selling frenzy. If anyone truly raids the public, it's their own instincts of greed and hope, not some invisible bear contingent. The public wants a simple explanation, but I cannot offer them that comfort. I can only speak the truth. The market crashes when insiders have finished selling, and the public remains with the illusion that the trend will last forever. Every bull market ends the same way. First, easy gains, then peak euphoria, finally a disastrous fall. And in every cycle, the public always plays the same old role, the last to arrive, the one holding the torch after the parade has dispersed. Looking back over my journey, I realized one thing: speculation doesn't disappear, nor should it. Many view it as a vice, a disease to be eradicated. But in truth, speculation is the bloodstream of the market, the way prices reflect expectations and fears. Without speculation, the market would be a gloomy bazaar, with no one daring to put capital forward for the future. I once saw bucket shops spring up everywhere, then get shut down. They were indeed places where many novices lost all their money, but they were also my school. Today, the exchanges have eliminated them, tightened rules, but abuse has never disappeared. It only changes for more sophisticated tricks, games hidden in the shadows. Everything still revolves around human greed. One of the things I despised most was the so-called market letters that many brokerage firms sent to clients. They seemed like insightful analyses, well-founded recommendations, but in reality, many of these letters were just smoke screens. The firm had just received sell orders from insiders. Those within wanted to unload their shares and simultaneously wrote letters advising clients to buy. That wasn't advice. It was a blatant conflict of interest, and the public, as always, trusted those words, making themselves the outlet for the sell-offs. I always reiterated, never buy just because you read a glowing report, because today's earnings report says nothing about tomorrow. The market always anticipates the economy by 6 to 9 months. When a company reports brilliant profits, the stock price may have already reflected that months ago. And when the outlook for the next 6 to 9 months is bleak, even if today's report is good, the price will still turn downward. This is an iron law that the public rarely accepts. They want to believe that current data is proof of the future. But the ticker doesn't look at today, it looks ahead. Those who understand that survive, while those who forget will soon be crushed by the market. And so, I didn't believe in tips, didn't believe in market letters, didn't believe in explanations blaming the bears. I only believed in what I saw from the ticker and believed that human nature doesn't change. The games will repeat under new contexts, with new names, but still revolve around greed, fear, and hope. As I conclude this period, I don't paint a rosy picture. I only know that the path ahead still holds many traps, many unexpected drops. But I also know that as long as I adhere to the principles of going with the trend, respecting the path of least resistance, and never losing sight of human nature, I will still have my place. And that is all a speculator can hope for: to survive long enough to witness many more repetitions of history, right up to the final pages. The story of the steps taken on Wall Street is not just a chronicle of a speculator's life, but also a mirror reflecting desires, mistakes, and the inevitable paradoxes humans face when confronting the market. If, throughout this journey, you found a piece that reminds you of yourself, the hesitation, the hope, the fear, or the desire to overcome, then the book has fulfilled its mission.